I do believe, however, that the best work, our most creative and best work, comes from a love of craft. But sometimes in order to find what you truly love, you have to be scared into setting off on a path to find it. And that goes for relationships too. Sometimes to find the right relationship or relationships, it could be friendships, romantic relationships, etc. One has to be like deathly afraid of having to remain in the relationship that you're in enough to leave. So neuroplasticity is absolutely real. Neuroplasticity is actually a feature of the nervous system, the brain, throughout our entire lifespan. The rules change a little bit in terms of how you rewire your brain. But if the question is, can a person change? Can you learn new things? Can you unlearn certain patterns? Can you overcome traumas at any age? The answer is absolutely, categorically, yes. How? Well, it's very clear that as a child, until about age 25, more or less, just passive experience will shape the brain, for better or worse. After about age 25, and again, these are not strict cutoffs, we can change our brain, but what's required is a marked shift in the neurochemical environment under which something happens. So one of the reasons why any traumatic event will forever be remembered, although, by the way, you can remove some of the emotional load of that. Trauma does not have to be traumatic forever, is because when we see or experience something very intense of a fearful nature, there's the release of certain what we call neuromodulators, things like epinephrine, adrenaline, and other neuromodulators that cause a state shift in our body and brain. And the nervous system recognizes this as unusual, and as a consequence, in the subsequent days, there's reordering of the connections so that the brain can prepare for that event should it happen again. This is why we have what's called one trial learning. You go to a certain location, something terrible happens there, you will forever associate that location with something terrible. But there are tools, therapy and other tools, that can allow the emotional load to be removed from that so that you could go to that location and feel calm, no fear whatsoever. The good news is you can also learn anything you want to learn, provided there's a shift in this neurochemical environment. This is why when we are very interested and focused on something, two of the main requirements for neuroplasticity, we have to be alert and we have to be focused. We can't learn passively as adults. We can't just play, a lecture about AI and large language models or neuroscience in the room, and then the knowledge doesn't just sink in by osmosis. But if we pay attention, and we're alert when we pay attention, there's a shift in the neurochemicals associated with that attention, what we call the catecholamines. It's 3 molecules, dopamine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine, all which cause an increase in alertness, all which cause an increase in focus, a tightening of our visual field and our auditory field. So like cones of attention is one way to think about it. And then it sets in motion a bunch of biological processes such that if we get adequate sleep that night, maybe the next night as well, there's reordering of neural connections so that that knowledge, that new experience is consolidated in your brain. You are forever changed as a consequence of that experience. So when we hear that the brain is constantly changing, everything that we encounter changes our brain, that's not true. Why would the brain change unless it needed to, right? As a child, the brain is basically a template for change. It's trying to understand the environment and make predictions. And so that's true. Neuroplasticity is a cardinal feature of childhood and adolescence and the teen years. And just think about the music you listened to when you were a teen. No other music will ever have as much significance. And that's because as a teen, your body is flooded with hormones and neuromodulators. That the amount of meaning that comes from now seemingly trivial events when you're a teenager or adolescent is immense. That song meant so much, and it's because of the neurochemical milieu it creates in you. But as an adult, it takes a stronger stimulus, as we say. And if you were to fall in love as an adult or see something, a painting that just strikes you as just so unbelievable, yes, then you are forever changed. But just going to see a bunch of paintings at the Met doesn't mean that every single one of those paintings is forever stamped into your brain. The nervous system is very efficient in that way. It doesn't change unless it has to. And it always changes if it needs to in order to keep you safe. This is why there's an asymmetric influence of fear as opposed to just interest in terms of what will shift our brain. But it's nice to know that love and excitement and appreciation are very strong stimuli for changing the brain. So in any case, you absolutely can change your brain, but you have to pay attention to the thing you want to incorporate into your brain. You have to be alert while you do that, and then you absolutely have to go get some rest, because it's during sleep and during meditative states and during rest that the actual rewiring of the brain occurs. Stories are very powerful and very dangerous. Stories are the way that humans organize knowledge, by and large, right? We don't tend to organize things into lists. We have these narratives that we call stories, because from a young age, we learn things not just by hearing them and seeing them, but they are compartmentalized into narratives that have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Sometimes they have a kind of a crescendo and then a relaxation. Just think about a childhood song of learning like the ABCs. They don't teach you the ABCs, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, right? They don't do that. What do? They give you a song, which is a story. Musicians will understand this inherently. Again, I'm not one, but when I started researching neuroscience of music and the brain, came to understand, so it's A, B, C, D, E, F, G, right? The change in the inflections as one does the alphabet as a young kid is the story of the alphabet. Now, people might say, okay, what is he talking about? What's happening here is you create variation in terms of batching of ideas so that something has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So if you think, okay, I grew up in this house and it was really messy and now I have too much mess, and in order to undo that, there's this kind of like hardwired, right, dangerous words, hardwired neural circuitry in my brain that I would have to work really, really hard to undo, and I'd have to be scared into being a cleaner person or a more tidier person, whatever it is. That's very dangerous, because there's a beginning to that, a middle to that, and an end to that, and it has immense meaning as a consequence. One of the most powerful things is to understand that neuroplasticity really involves taking an existing story and dismantling some component of it. What could the component be? Well, there's all this stuff like the Byron Katie work, which says, you take something that you believe as true and you say, okay, like I'm an untidy person, and then you counter it. How do I know that? Well, okay, I have this experience. Okay, that's the story. And then you start running counter narratives. You say, I'm actually a tidy person. And then people say, well, this is silly. You're just lying to yourself, right? Or they say, is it always true that you're a messy person? You start challenging this story from different sides. Now, I believe, because I'm a neuroscientist, I'm not a psychologist or in the self-help world, that the brilliance, the kind of unconscious genius of that approach is actually that what one is doing is you're starting to create a new story. You're starting to kind of infuse different questions into the existing neural network. Now, the brain loves questions. Like the brain, since we're young kids, we're asking questions. And so if you take an existing story and you start challenging it with questions, you're not saying lie to yourself. You're not suddenly gonna say, okay, like I'm super tidy. You're not, because you're not gonna believe that. But if you start challenging why it's that way, or you've been able to change so many other things, why wouldn't you be able to change that? Well, you say, well, it's just a habit, I can't do it. You say, well, what's a habit? And you start poking and pushing and pushing. What you eventually arrive at is this kind of, actually, there's nothing keeping me from being a tidy person except this kind of fluency of a particular story. And what you've done is you've interrupted the fluency of that story. So then when you go to the behavior of, do you set things down all over the place or do you put them in an orderly fashion? You start interrupting the habit, the fluency of your typical behavior. So I raise this as a way to kind of shine light on essentially what I do in my podcast career, which is, I believe very strongly in the fields of psychology. I think self-help has some wonderful things to offer. We've got ancient wisdom that goes way back. And when you start to look at things through the lens of biology, you start to see that all of these things actually have merit, and they're just different paths to the same outcomes. Mm-hmm. So if you wanted to become a tidy person, I would encourage you, here would be one, let's just say neuroscience supported approach would be to write out one page about what a tidy person you really are. You'll know that's a lie, right? And then to look at it and realize that in many ways, if you just replace tidy with, messy at any location, it'd probably be the exact same story. Mm-hmm. And so what you're really talking about here is just a default that your nervous system is running. And if you were to just swap the words, would you feel differently or do differently? On the one hand, you'd say, no, that's kind of trivial, but I bet you the practice of writing it out would forever interrupt your notion of like just going to set something down. You'd be like, now you have something to kind of disrupt the habit. Because so much of habit disruption that you'll look like, some people say, oh, you flick a rubber band on your wrist or something like that. Mm-hmm. There's nothing special about the rubber band. There's nothing special about the pain on your wrist or you put a sticky note. We know sticky notes work for about one day. Why don't sticky notes work? Why don't reminders on the mirror work? Because they don't have enough salience. They're not new, they're not different. The nervous system only changes if something is new and different. So anyway, we could talk a lot about habit formation, but fear works, but so does disrupting the story. How do you disrupt the story? You essentially give the opposite story and you think, well, that's just lying to myself. But neurally, it makes sense because the nervous system, again, likes to be very economical, likes to do everything with the minimum amount of energetic expenditure. And to change anything requires attention, and attention is expensive. Attention is expensive. And also, I would say, as I'm kind of rambling all this, my advice to anyone who wants to be successful in any domain is to do things away from where you broadcast and then take it to that broadcast. I mean, take your real life to Instagram and be very cautious about taking Instagram to your real life. If I pick up the phone and I start making a phone call, it's like, is this call really about moving the needle forward, or is this just kind of like passive use of attention? We have to be so careful nowadays, so careful. It's really challenging. Goal setting and habit formation, fear setting is often one of the best tools. You spend some time, maybe 5 minutes or so, thinking about all the terrible things that are going to happen if you don't actually accomplish your goals. Nobody likes to do this, but guess what? It turns out to be pretty darn effective.
Really?
I know. It's really frustrating that this is the case. But again, that has a lot to do with the way that the human brain is wired and likes to rewire itself. Now, that said, it is important to envision goals. Visualizing goals in detail, writing them out, in some cases talking about them, although we can discuss that, why that might not be the best idea in every circumstance, can be very beneficial because it's hard to conceive something that you can't imagine. But I think when people hear that visualizing goals or visualizing outcomes is critical, we sometimes forget that we don't always know what the end goal is. Sometimes we have to break this up into milestones, that the metamorphosis that leads to great music, great poetry, great scientific discovery, podcasts, finance, companies that one is building, et cetera, is a series of iterations that occur on the time course of about a day, And so we can't always imagine the end or the end product as the outcome. This is why I said university is easy compared to other goals, because the end is a degree, right? So you pick up your diploma. Whereas in other areas, it's far more mysterious often. Now, visualization, I think, can be very powerful, but perhaps what's more powerful is to learn the brain and body state that best serves the work you're going to do. So for instance, if I'm going to do some writing, and right now I'm working on a book, it's largely done, but I'm writing some bonus chapters. Unless I'm hyper motivated to do that when I sit down and hyper focused, I'll spend 2-3 minutes just closing my eyes, focusing on my breathing. It's meditation of sorts, but what I tell myself is if I can't focus on my breathing for 2 or 3 minutes, how in the world am I going to focus on writing for 2 or 3 hours? That sort of thing. The other thing that I want to make sure I don't forget is I mentioned that telling people your goals oftentimes can be useful if it stimulates a little bit of fear, like you have some accountability. But we also know that because of the affiliative nature of people, in particular people that support us, there is this danger. A friend of mine who's a cardiologist at UCSF taught me this. He said, be careful who you tell that you're going to start a podcast or write a book, because oftentimes the response will be, oh yeah, that's great. You absolutely should write a book or you should do a podcast. And people get a sort of reward from telling people about it, and then they never actually go do it. Whereas I can cite numerous examples of where people were told, you're never going to be able to do that. You're never going to be able to be successful in that. And my goodness, those people dig their heels and they show that they can do it. Now, it's unclear to me whether or not the energy around trying to prove oneself is detrimental to the outcome. And I sense it is, right? This kind of grinding against like, oh, take that and take that, as opposed to just doing things out of real love of craft. I think about the way I felt about aquaria and fish as a kid, and it's just like pure delight. That's the word that comes to mind, just delight. I want to learn more about it. I want to do it and tell people about it. That's the wonderful romantic picture of effort and progress and outcomes. But in reality, you probably need both. You need to be able to access some fear and sense of competition, but also delight in craft. You know, like Peter Thiel's book, 0 to 1, as I recall, defines competition as anti-creativity in many ways, because through competition, you are, by definition, changing what you're doing in order to outdo somebody else or something else. And so you're morphing your creation in order to kind of overcome something. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you're just purely thinking about something you want to grow and cultivate, there are none of those barriers. Competition fosters outcomes. This is clear in markets, it's clear in a lot of domains, but pure love and delight of craft and creativity, that's definitely the way to go. But in most endeavors, you got to have both. If sitting next to someone in class and realizing, okay, because this was me back when, I'm thinking, okay, I love this topic, but gosh, I want that top mark. I want that top mark on the distribution. Like that's, and like she and he are really, really good. And we're going to study together. But my God, when it comes time for that exam, like I'm going for it. A little bit of competition can bring out our best, I think, certainly in sport. I always feel like competition can bring out more energy, but not more creativity.